Well, good afternoon, everyone. Well, welcome to our third Tea Talk of our Eleanor William Hooker series. This year's series, Bringing It Back, focuses on conversations that we as a community still need to have. Last week, we came together to speak about the divisive concept bills and education. That was an amazing panel with some amazing panelists, and the information there was just so worthwhile to get. And also, we learned about what we could do inside our community to protect against the erasure of history in our education system. But for today's conversation, our panelists will share with us the history and personal stories of Black landowners and discriminatory practices that have prevented wealth accumulation, which led to the enormous loss of farmland owned by Black families. More than that, we will hear stories, personal stories of resilience among those families that own farmland today, and the new and innovative ways that Black New England farmers are creating innovative ways for economic opportunities of empowerment and to reclaim land for generations to come. For those of you who are joining us virtually, please put any questions when we get to our Q&A into the chat, and we will make every effort to get to them as we see them. For today's event, it has been made possible by our sponsors, Revision Energy, the Justice Seekers with the St. John's United Methodist Church in Dover, the Portsmouth Public Library, who has lent us their beautiful room today, and also, this has also been put on by a grant from New Hampshire Humanities. And I also would like to mention Whole Foods for donating some of the snacks and refreshments that we have today as well. So with that, let's get started. And I'll introduce you to our moderator for this panel, Karen A. Spiller, a professor in sustainability food systems at UNH in Durham, New Hampshire.
Thank you, Terry, and thank you for inviting me in this room. I'm a little still not with us because I usually am singing that spiritual and not standing and listening to someone else sing it. And it also is one of my childhood anchoring ways of being that just brought me back to being with my parents in church at NACP, National American Peoples of Color Association, at the March reenactment in DC, being with them in those moments of standing for and praying for something different. So give me a couple of minutes. I want to start with Isaiah 65:21. It was shared with one of our guests today, speakers today, and it really does anchor what we are sharing today. And they shall build houses and inhabit them, and they shall plant vineyards, and they shall eat from the fruit from them. I'm going to say it again. And they shall build houses and inhabit them, and they shall plant vineyards and eat the fruit of them. That is what was intended for all of us. And we're going to spend time in just exploring how that scripture anchoring the human beings and weaving them and linking them together, its message, its spirit, its story has been lost, but we are bringing it back. We're bringing it back through conversations like this, so thank you so much for being here. In honor of Eleanor Williams Hooker, we gather together this brand new day. And yes, bringing it back, the history, the lived experiences, so that we can bask in the light of that legacy of the power innovation and resilience that's threaded through, woven through our bodies and our spirits. I want to share with you some histories around land loss, land access, that I think is anchoring also when we're talking about all this today. It's really important to understand that land loss for Black people, whether it's farming land or housing land, certainly was intentional. We have to also understand that the birthing of America or the finding of America was one of those moments in time that contributed to that intentionally. The colonists coming, as we call them colonists, people from Britain, looking for something different, looking for a way to live out their spirituality because they were not being able to do it under the rule. And they were looking for an opportunity to be able to be themselves, live a quality life as we call it now, and for their children and for their friends and relatives. And they came to this land already habited, already being nourished, cared for, because again, it was caring for the land and the ocean. It was living in community with the land and the ocean. And coming and changing all of that, the spirit and the intent, to violence, death, that still continues to live in and foundationally be a part of that coming to America. So when we think about that, local states and governments were creating laws that segregated America, starting from way back from the New Deal. Government policies were considered created for white and middle class families, but Black families were pushed into the smaller, less desired areas of urban blight, without access, without water, without, we call it now, full grocery stores with access to healthy foods. So it's interesting with the things we're seeing now or the things that they were living with then. Contributors to the Black land loss were certainly the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing slaves, but did not provide the right to own land. And Keith is going to talk a lot of these things too, but I just want to come in with an understanding that after the Civil War, some states passed laws prohibiting persons of color from owning real property. It was designed, always designed, for some and not for others. There was the continuing on with the Homestead Act of 1862, restricting acquisition of land in the West to whites only. Jim Crow policies that allowed separate treatment of whites and Blacks. The GI Bill, another place of racist implementations, where white veterans obtained low-interest loans for homes and tuition benefits for their college education, and Black veterans were funneled into vocational education and received very few home loans. Sharecropping became a common practice where tenants were charged high interest rates that created, again, inescapable debt. Always intended. It was intended to be this. Policies and practices created to continue to other as opposed to create something that we all could prosper and grow in. Heirs property laws, those are the descendants of owners, have to share in the land, but most consent to sales. The land had been handed down through families without a will, and it's pretty common throughout the Black communities, in the Southeast particularly, and it was fraught with peril. The landowner would die, transition without the will, and so the offsprings inherit the property but really don't know how they can access it. Continually, and I'm sure some of you know and have been experiencing that in your own family legacy. So those are some of the laws, some of the intentional ways that we created Black land loss and challenge barriers to obtaining it, to nurturing it, to growing it. So I'm going to pause there, just in terms of that's some of the history in that, and I'll share later some of the ways we have been able to move through that. But again, it's important to know it's bringing it back so we can know where we're going. Your liberation, your wealth, your health, our liberation, our health, our wealth is tied. So yours to mine and mine to yours. And humanity and healing need to be at the core of all of this. Policies and practices were created by hearts and minds. Yes, those are human beings with hearts and minds when they made those decisions that created all of the pain and continued suffering for others. But we can create and orchestrate policies, laws, and ways of being that can feed and serve us all. So it's tea time, right? It's tea time. And whether, it's time to sit, some of us are sitting and are at home or somewhere where we're on the Zoom. Welcome, welcome. And with a cozy beverage, I hope. And here, whether it's figuratively or literally, we're going to be sipping from that cup. And in that, the hearts and our minds in this conversation today continue to be here and be present as we continue the conversation about beyond the 40 acres, land ownership, and Black wealth. So it's tea time. It's tea time. So I have the honor to introduce, and I must say, the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire is thrilled to have Crystal Rawlins Jackson and Keith W. Stokes with us this afternoon, and to share the history and their personal stories of land ownership, discriminatory practices, and the way that wealth was prevented and to be accumulated, and certainly the enormous loss of wealth building that Black families have experienced. So Crystal Rawlins Jackson is the president of Beacon Hill Scholars in Boston, Massachusetts, an organization that's dedicated to the preservation of the history of the 19th century African-American abolitionist. 19th century African-American abolitionists. Just hold that. And they lived and owned businesses on Beacon Hill in Boston. So you all know, if you know nothing else in Boston, you know Beacon Hill, right? And she's an artist, a poet, photographer, and a lover of history. And legacy, history and legacy, that's powerful. And is currently writing about her maternal ancestors, the Black Loyalists of Nova Scotia. That's where many of our ancestors, we can say fled, but journeyed to get away from what was going on in Boston. And as well as her Nipmuc heritage in Natick, Massachusetts. She's currently serving as the vice president of Sisters in Stitches, joined by the cloth. So that's that creative piece there with the quilting. And then we also have her as the publication manager at Community Church of Boston. So we have Keith W. Stokes is a lead researcher and co-author of A Matter of Truth, The Struggle for African Heritage and Indigenous People, Equal Rights in Business. This is Providence, Rhode Island that it's focusing on. He has a long and distinguished career in business, historic preservation, and community development. It says here career, but that's your life. That's your spirit. That's who you are. That's, we would say that's your DNA. So it's not a vocation. It is you.
But I like being paid also.
Absolutely. Now that's the beauty of that.
Yes.
We all look for that, the things we love to do and get such nourishment from, that we can get a little income from it as well. That's a bonus. That's a bonus. And with that, he's been advisor for Rhode Island with the National Trust for Historic Preservation and served on numerous local and regional national business and public boards, and really in preservation, economic work development, and currently on a national historical program, including C-SPAN. So he's on media. He's able to share his knowledge, his voice, and lived experience through C-SPAN, Fox News, Legend and Lies, and TED Talk. So that was abbreviated bio. So you certainly can read more online or in the program. And Crystal, would you begin? So Crystal will begin in sharing her legacy journey.
Good afternoon. So nice to see you all. Let me just get my little. So I'm going to just tell you a little bit about one of my ancestors who lived on Beacon Hill. His name was George Washington. Just waiting for my presentation. Yeah, his name was George Gray Washington. And I'm not sure if there's any connection. So I'm looking for my. So my ancestor George Washington called Beacon Hill, Boston, Mass, his home in 1828. You can go to the next slide. Okay. How's this? Is this better? Okay. Good. All right. So hold it there. He was born in Fredericksburg, Virginia, about 1797. Now, I'm not sure when he left Fredericksburg or when he arrived in Boston, but he may have left Virginia shortly after his father, and most likely owner, Major Churchill Jones, passed away in September of 1822. Next slide. This came to light to me only in the last couple of weeks after messaging another descendant, actor Joe Manganiello. He was just on Finding Your Roots. So we share an ancestor. So George is listed in Boston City Directory, living on northern slope of Beacon Hill at 29 Beacon Street in 1830. You can slide, please. This is what it looks like today. So today, Belknap is now Joy Street. He was just a few minutes walk away from the First Independent Baptist Church, where he served as deacon for 40 years. You can slide. I'm getting used to this. I thought I was going to do it myself. He made his living by working as a bootblack and at the time as a waiter at the foot of the hill on Water Street. This was the era where a diverse Black community lived and came from all walks of life. Some were free, some were newly freed, and others were hidden in plain sight. People like abolitionists David Walker, Lewis and Harriet Hayden, Coffin Pitts, and William C. Nell, next slide, called the undesirable Guinea Hill home. Although some white immigrants lived on the northern slope, most white people lived on the southern side of the hill, where there was more sunlight and less of the biting sea breeze that made its way from the nearby wharfs. Next slide. Next. Okay, yep. And although today the distance from the wharfs to the hill has increased due to the landfill, I can attest to that biting sea breeze still remains, especially on a cold winter's day. George eventually moved directly across from the African Meeting House and rented 3 Smith Court. Slide. Yep. He lived on one side of the building while Andrew and Rachel Telford with their family lived on the other side. Now, I'd like to read an excerpt taken from the 2002 research of the Historic Research Study Boston African American National Historic Site by Catherine Grover and Janine De Silva. So 3 Smith Court was built between 1798 and 1800 by 2 white bricklayers and is now known as the James Scott and William C. Nell House. The front of this wide but shallow 2-family consists of a yellow painted clapboarding. The back of the house is a windowless brick wall. This type of construction was typical for Boston before 1803, and especially for residents on alleys. Starting in 1830, 3 Smith Court was rented to numerous African American men and their families. Now, from 1830 until 1845, one side of the house was rented by Boot Black, my ancestor, and waiter, George Washington. The other side was rented by the barber, Andrew Telford, and his wife, Rachel Turner. James Scott, the longest resident of 3 Smith Court, lived there for nearly 50 years. He was a tenant from 1839 to 1865 and owned the property from 1865 until his death in 1888. And Scott was born in Virginia and worked as a clothing dealer in Boston. In 1851, Scott was arrested in his shop and charged with spearheading the rescue of Shadrach Minkins from federal custody. It is not clear whether he actually participated in this rescue. He was acquitted for lack of evidence. But Scott did assist other fugitive slaves. For example, on July 18, 1856, James Scott boarded self-emancipated slave Henry Jackson and his family at 3 Smith Court. From 1850 to 1857, William Cooper Nell was also a tenant of 3 Smith Court. Nell was one of Boston's most forceful advocates for school integration. He was the author of several histories, including Colored Patriots of the American Revolution, and he worked at various times for the Liberator, the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, and the Frederick Douglass paper. He was also very active in the Boston Vigilance Committee, and he sheltered or aided numerous of emancipated slaves at 3 Smith Court. And so during this time period, George was a tenant at 3 Smith Court, and he married Andrew and Rachel's daughter, Rachel, on April 1st, 1829. They would go on to have 11 children, and it would take George and Rachel 20 years before they could purchase the house next door. Now, according to the National Historical Sites research, 5 Smith Court, next slide, please, a 3-story building with reddish-brown clapboard siding was constructed within the first decade of the 19th century, and it had passed through the hands of several owners, both black and white. Peter Wilcox and his wife, Chloe, and their 5 children were part of a group that migrated with mariner Paul Cuffey to Sierra Leone. The home remained in the Washington family until 1917. So George was active in the abolitionist movement. He's responsible for writing the charter for the Abiel Smith School. Slide, please. And over the course of 30 years, and you can hit the next one. This is what it looks like today.
Sorry to interrupt, but can you speak louder and into the mic?
Oh,
They're still having a hard
okay, I'm sorry. Do you want me to start from the beginning? Okay. So George, he wrote the charter for the Abel Smith School, and over a course of 30 years, he signed many anti-slavery petitions. George was a member of the Crispus Attucks Glee Club, and the family often performed as a quartet. Daughter Rachel was the first African American to graduate from the New England Conservatory, and she published a book on music composition and was also the music director for the church. Their son Benjamin served in the Navy during the Civil War. He and his family moved to Stoughton, where they owned a farm and greenhouse on Pleasant Street, and he worked as a florist. So I'm going to talk about George's wife. We don't usually have a lot of information about women. They're usually unnoticed and unknown, but in Rachel's case, we have a bit of information. So Rachel, George's wife, Rachel Telford, is the granddaughter of Plato and Rachel Turner. She was born about 1786 in Plymouth, Massachusetts, that is, most likely at the Parting Ways, New Guinea settlement. Her grandfather, Plato Turner, along with 3 other former Black Revolutionary soldiers, and you can turn the slide, sorry, along with, I'm sorry, I've lost my place. Her grandfather, Plato Turner, along with 3 other former Black Revolutionary soldiers, were given 94 acres of land in 1792 by the town of Plymouth for their service in the war. This property remained in the family's possession for at least 3 generations. Rachel's cousin, James Thurston Burr, slide please, moved back there after a very illustrious career as a body servant to Congressman Alexander Lawrence. He was also a barber, and when he was a boy, he worked as a roller boy and an all-around devil for William Lloyd Garrison in the Liberator's office. Obviously, I could spend a lot more time talking about Mr. Burr, but in an interview that appeared in the Globe in 1895, Burr said that he had moved back to Parting Ways because he wanted to be close to his ancestors. He passed away the following year, and then at some point the homestead burnt down. So all that remains is the cemetery. Parting Ways Cemetery, it says on the gravestone, "Here lies the graves of 4 Negro slaves, Quamini, Prince, Plato, Cato. These men fought in the Revolutionary War and were freed at the close. The cemetery is located in the original 94-acre plot of the land, which was deeded to them by the government when they were given their freedom." And I just have to mention that this land was really uninhabitable, and so it really wasn't a gift. You could not grow anything on it, and so for their livelihood, I'm sure they went other places to work. And so I'm going to close with an image of my great-great-grandmother, Hattie Camps Fowler. She's here with her grandchildren, most likely taken after my great-great-grandfather Israel passed away in Lynn, at their home on Utah Ave in Lynn, Massachusetts. So, and I'm showing you this because in the middle, in the back, is Buster, and I only knew him as Buster, but his official name was Henry Washington Jr., and he was a great-grandson of Benjamin Washington. And so we're all continue to be connected in ways and sometimes that we don't even know. And so Bessie and Israel, they own their home in Lynn, but they also owned a farm in New Hampshire. Slide. In Barnstead, New Hampshire. So like Plato, the Fowlers were granted land in Nova Scotia, and after serving in the Revolutionary War on the side of the British, they migrated back to the U.S. Starting in the 1870s. So I don't really know what happened with this farm, but there's my uncle and my a cousin remember going there. So they had the farm probably from the 1920s to the 1950s, but it did not stay in the family. So, thank you.
Crystal, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you for anchoring us in heart and family as we continue this journey towards something different as we are bringing us back. So thank you so much, much gratitude. Keith, would you share with us what you have been chronicling in your research and your own legacy journey?
Good afternoon, everyone. My wife and I are here from far away Newport, Rhode Island. But what I'm going to attempt to do is to provide about 300 years of history in 12 minutes or less. So I apologize if we're rushing through, but a lot of content, a lot of history, but a very important history. I've had the opportunity over the last several years in Rhode Island to lead not only most of the economic development functions for the state and private sector, but also much of the historic preservation work within the African heritage community. It all culminated several years ago when I was asked by Mayor Alorza of Providence, with my wife, the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, and other scholars, to develop a comprehensive assessment of the history of racialized discrimination. So we created a report, the Matter of Truth Report, which runs from about 1620 to 2020, over 300 pages, but more importantly, nearly 700 footnotes of primary, secondary sources. And what that report set the stage for was for the city to then bring me in and develop and really develop what we think is the nation's first and comprehensive reparations investment strategies with $10.5 million set aside, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But what I'm going to do today is to talk a little bit about the analysis in the history, in the preservation, in really understanding the life that our African indigenous ancestors were able to survive and thrive to have this dialogue today. Next slide. So let me begin very quickly with the very founding of the Western Hemisphere, of the Americas, is based on two very basic premises: the taking and use of indigenous people land, and then the taking and use of free African labor. It's land and labor. So every country, every colony, every family, every institution that would begin in the 17th and then literally extend itself in the 18th century began with those two basic premises: free land, free labor. In many of the institutions today, many of the founding wealthy families of today had that start. Wouldn't it have been wonderful if you were African or indigenous to have that type of start? But we did not. So it's important to recognize that the very beginnings and foundings is tied to those premises. And if you happen to be indigenous or you happen to be of African heritage, you saw no direct benefit in your land, in your labor. And that is the very founding of the Western Hemisphere. That's British North America, South and Central America, the Caribbean. It's everything in the Western Hemisphere. Next slide. But what's most important to recognize is that something by the end of the 18th century changes dramatically. In fact, the first great emancipation is not 1865, it's not Abraham Lincoln, and it's not the conclusion of the Civil War. The first great emancipation is between 1777 and then by the close of the 18th century, starting with Vermont, when every New England now state and then Northeast states would either immediately or gradually abolish slavery. So by the end of the 18th century, you had something here in the North, particularly in New England, that never existed before: free Africans. Now, not African American, not BIPOC, not colored, not Negro, not black. They're Africans. And these early Africans begin the process of identifying themselves as Africans in America. And they're now buying land, They're taking the trade skills that they honed over generations as enslaved chattel property and now building their own businesses. They're creating their own civic, religious, and cultural organizations. And in fact, many of the first black everything in America is not Richmond, Virginia. It's not New Orleans. It's not South Carolina or Mississippi. It's places like Boston, in New Hampshire, and Rhode Island, and Connecticut. Next slide, please. And being a Newporter, I have to throw this in. It's a Newport model. The first free African Union Society to be established in the Western Hemisphere is November 10th, 1780. We know this because the original records, the diaries, the minute books still exist in the collections of the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society and Newport Historical Society. And those African tradesmen in forming this organization had three basic premises. One, they would ensure that every African who had died at that time would have a proper akan, cultural burial. Akan meaning most of the Africans that arrived in colonial New England, and particularly in Rhode Island, came from what was called the Gold Coast. Today we recognize that as northern Nigeria and Ghana. The Yoruba people of Nigeria and the Akan people of Ghana. And as those Africans arrived, they did not arrive as blank slates, and they brought more than their labor. They brought their language, their culture, their food stuff. And as they became free, they began to identify and express that African culture. So having an African burial and having a place where they would raise money and ensure that every African would have a proper burial is one of the reasons why Newport, Rhode Island has the largest and oldest existing African burial ground in America. Nearly 300 markers dating back to 1705. But if I could take you across countrysides anywhere across New England, you would find African burials. So it's important to recognize that this new African society would establish a burying society, a school, and by 1808, both Boston at the African Meeting House and Newport at the African Meeting House would establish free African schools. Free meaning African-owned, African-operated, African-taught, our school. No white oversight. And then later, they would evolve into free African churches. In the case of Newport, because of the guidance and support of the Congregational Church, the first free African church becomes the Union Colored Congregational Church. In Providence, Rhode Island, it becomes a Cogman Street Baptist Church. Next slide, please. And what's important to understand, this beginning of this African Union Society movement, is that the Africans in Newport are corresponding with free Africans in Philadelphia, in Boston, and in Providence. In fact, one of the great ironies today is that, and Crystal really pointed that out, the earliest free African communities are the North Slope of Beacon Hill, College Hill, Providence, and Historic Hill, Bellevue Avenue, Newport. I can barely walk through those neighborhoods today. But each and every one of those neighborhoods had African origins, and then later African-American communities, where we built our wealth, owned our businesses, and managed as our place of worship. Today, we can barely walk through those communities. But what happened with these early Africans is they're literally corresponding with each other, and they're building African societies in each of those communities. In Philadelphia, the Reverend Richard Allen, who would go on to found the first Mother Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, his counterpart, Absalom Jones, the first African Anglican Church, they actually received money from Newport to help build their denominations. And then they're corresponding with Newport and saying, can we send some of the Philadelphia folks up? We'd like to go to Boston. We've heard about this man called Hall, Prince Hall. And Newport gives an invitation to the Philadelphia Africans to meet Prince Hall, who would go on to establish the first Prince Hall, now affiliate Masonic order. So when we talk about the first of African organization and leadership and ownership, it's happening right here in our doorsteps. And remarkably, many of these historic structures still stand. They might unfortunately be an Airbnb or have other uses, but at some point they were occupied by people of African descent. Next slide. And in the 19th century, something changes dramatically. You have these large pockets of free Africans. It's the North Slope in Boston, it's Beacon Hill, you have it in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Bridgeport, Connecticut is called Little Liberia, Bristol, Philadelphia, New York. Philadelphia has the largest free African heritage community, almost 20,000 souls by the antebellum era. So what you begin to see during that early 19th century is a significant, organized, lawful pushback of African ownership and growth. In fact, between 1820 and 1850, before the American Civil War, you have the first group of race riots in nearly every one of those cities. Every single one of those cities where there were large, active, vibrant African communities, there were race riots. And these riots were perpetrated by government systems who would literally cajole the early arriving European, Irish, and Germans who were, again, looking for shared space, shared lives, and they would be set up to create race riots based on race and sometimes religion. And every single one of those communities faced that. And then when those riots ended, in fact, in the case of Providence, we have significant documentation of not only two major race riots in 1824 and 1831, we also have a database of all the names of the families of African descent and indigenous descent who lost properties and homes and were literally pushed out of those communities. And I want to be clear, this was going on in every major African heritage enclave across the Northeast at that time. Later, particularly in New England, Boston, Providence, New Haven, would set were called warning out laws, policies that were determined that anyone to receive a benefit who can remain within our town, as we're now newly incorporating, would have to show a proof of residency or come before a town council of selectmen who would determine if you were deemed a resident of that town. Going through thousands and thousands of records of that time, close to 70% of the people who were warned out of town because of the challenge of their residency were people of color, and almost always women of color. And we have cases where you're in Providence and you get warned out, you go to Boston, and then you're in Roxbury, and then they warn you out, then you go to Narragansett, Rhode Island, then they warn you out. They're always dislodging people from their homes, their neighborhoods, and their properties as a public policy. And by the 1840s, newly incorporated cities such as Providence and Boston and Baltimore and Philadelphia would now found and establish police forces who initially were there to oversee warning out policies and oversee what they thought were transient community populations. Next slide. And in fact, in the case of Providence, the newly installed mayor, as a part of his installation, has a significant discussion about the fact that our new police force and our new policies will specifically oversee, now we're called colored people and children. So it's important to recognize the challenge that we see today in policing in the community of color didn't start 10 years or 20 years or 50 or 100 years ago. It started at the inception of law enforcement that targeted African heritage people within their own communities that they lived within and struggled to maintain. Next slide. And in the 20th century, these warning out policies, these race riots, it still didn't dislodge us. We still hung on to our communities, our neighborhoods. You think of Nubian Square in Roxbury. In Providence, it becomes the College Hill area of Lippet Hill. We hang on. But in the 20s and 30s and 40s, a whole series of federal policies are in place to begin to further now lawfully disconnect us from our homes, our properties, and our wealth. And you see it embodied during FDR in the Great Depression in bringing forth for the first time federal policies that allowed access to mortgages, insurances. For the first time, limited income people, working poor people, if you were white, could have access to owning a home, which is probably the fastest path of building equity then and today and in the future. But if you happen to be of color and you happen to live in communities that were deemed, the term they used at the time, redlining, deemed unsatisfactory for investment, you could not qualify for mortgage insurance or business insurance or a primary loan. This is a map of the 1935 redlining of the city of Providence. The redlining communities that were excluded from federal mortgage insurance and lending are entirely African heritage with some poor whites and indigenous people mixed in. This map I could probably duplicate in every major city across America at that time. Next slide, please. And I just want to give you a case example because I had the opportunity in working in Providence to actually extract out every red line community, every person and family of color in business, because we wanted to really make this real to people. It's not a data, it's not a statistic, it's real people and families. And when we started to unveil real families who were being dislodged or withheld benefits, people today were saying, that was my grandparents. People came forward and said, that's my grandparents, that's my parents. That's where we used to live. And in the case of Lippet Hill is adjacent to Brown University. It was one of the most vibrant, free African heritage communities going back to the 18th century. It was a lot like Beacon Hill, a significant place that the city of Providence, through its newly formed redevelopment agency, through Federal Enabling Act and federal funding, would step in and clear what they said was blighted communities. And next slide, please. And I just want to point out, because black folks will get this, James Baldwin in the 60s, probably one of the greatest authors and literary critics, I think very succinctly created, I think, a very specific statement of what urban renewal or urban redevelopment was. In the black community, we called it urban removal and Negro removal. Next slide, please. And I just want to show you, this is a 1952 GIS map of the Lippert Hill community, a typical New England community, very densely compacted, multifamily homes. On the lower right is Hope High School that's still there. And next slide, please. And let me show you what it looks like after urban renewal and redevelopment. It's wiped off the face of the earth. 358 African heritage families were permanently removed from that area at a time when fair housing laws were not in place for another 15 years. So if you were black and living in Roxbury or Providence or New Haven or San Francisco or Chicago, and you were removed through urban renewal, you couldn't qualify for low-interest loans for a home, mortgages, mortgage insurance, and no one would let you in their community. So you literally lost your life, your livelihood, your equity, your wealth. Next slide, please. So let me just end with, what does that mean today? Well, for us today that's been working on reparations policy, we have simply defined reparations for indigenous African heritage people as closing the racial wealth gap. And we've used present-day statistics and data and economics to demonstrate and to qualify that people of African heritage and indigenous heritage today are still significantly poorer than their white counterparts, simply because of this legacy and history. They didn't have that head start, meaning a head start in the 17th century, or support in the 19th century, or certainly 20th century programs. And if we're going to reinvest today under a reparations program, it needs to focus exclusively on closing that wealth gap, building equity, building wealth, and giving these communities and children today, particularly, the chance to be equal citizens. And final slide, please. And I just want to end, I didn't bring enough of these, but we'll make sure we get more. My Newport ancestor was the pastor in the 19th century of the Union Colored Congregational Church. In 1885, he became the first black state representative, and he was a national speaker on equal rights. But in 1887, he wrote a narrative on the future of the Negro in Rhode Island, past, present, and future. And if you get a chance to read it, we'll make sure we get it out to you. He's talking specifically about owning land. He actually details 140 properties in Newport owned by Negroes, as we were called at that time. So he understood then that we need to understand today. You're not going to have equal opportunity. You're not going to achieve diversity and inclusion until we have equity. And equity means giving people of color their fair share to own a business, own a home, and have the choices of where they want to live, work, or worship. Thank you for this. And thank you, I did this close to 300 years.
Thank you, Keith, and thank you for sharing the timeline of those acts and actions that have they were taken to disconnect people of color, black people, African heritage people from the land, from property, and from all that fuels our souls. I just wanted to, in the spirit of that, today is the day that William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, known as W.E.B. Du Bois, organized the first meeting in Paris in 1919 of the Pan-African Conference. And that was to address issues then of what Africa was facing as a result of European colonization and how it flowed into most of the continent. Now, he was a socialist, he was a historian, he was a civil rights activist, author, writer, editor, born in Barrington, Great Barrington, Massachusetts. And he also, W.E.B. Du Bois, also was the first African American to earn a doctorate degree at Harvard University in Cambridge. And he once shared these words: "Now is the accepted time, not tomorrow, not some more convenient season. It is today that our best work can be done, not for some future day or some future year. It is today that we fit ourselves for the greater usefulness of tomorrow. Today is seed time. Now are the hours of work, and tomorrow comes the harvest and the playtime." So we've had seed time in our tea time. And we know that both Keith and Crystal, there was so much more we could hear and learn and you would share with us. But we certainly thank you for your generosity of giving us seed time today. We're going to transition to a moment that's really important. It's something that's one of the practices of the Black Heritage Trail here in New Hampshire. And it's close to them. And they hold it close because it's a way of creating a space for rich and dynamic dialogue and conversation and sharing learning among those who are joined here and who join in any of their gatherings like this. And this opens up a way to lean in and open our hearts and our minds and our spirits. So I would like to invite Michelle Holt-Shannon, Director and founder of New Hampshire Listens at the University Carsey School of Public Policy, to briefly review those community agreements, the community guidelines, before we continue.
Thank you, Dr. Spiller. It's good to see you all who are here in the room and all who are with us on Zoom. I am gonna pretty soon be your glorified mic runner. I'm gonna run around the room and also run over to Terry to see what questions we have online as well. But just a couple of things to keep in mind. Please be respectful and use respectful language. Please use the microphone. We have friends who need to hear, so even if you think you have a good teacher voice, we need you to use the microphone for us. Listen generously to learn. Please don't interrupt. Share airtime and get to your questions because we want to hear from our panelists as much as possible. Be mindful that good intentions can still have a harmful impact, so consider your words. And if you hear a story that you want to share, just ask permission. Otherwise, we ask that your stories stay here and learning leaves. All right, that does sound a little louder than the first one. I hope y'all could hear me. Okay, I turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. So these are moments that we will continue on this journey here. We'd like to begin with the Q&A portion of the program by breaking up in groups, small groups for 5 minutes to discuss questions. I have 2 questions here. I will just read the questions? Oh, perfect. These are the discussion questions. And again, small groups for 5 minutes. Those are online will be in breakouts so that they can respond to this. But what is your family story of home and property ownership? And how has that affected you socially and economically? So in the room, turn to your neighbor, or group up in some way. We have 5 minutes for this, and then we'll come back for a large group conversation.
It's so hard to do this in 10 minutes. Yeah, and also it's so awkward. I mean, I really like to control my slides. I mean, this is actually the first time that a program where they didn't have that set up for me. They must have, because that's pretty standard. Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, I do hundreds and hundreds, and this is the first time I've seen that. So yeah, I'll mention that to them, to Karen.
I don't have my watch with me, so let me know.
When you just have 10 minutes, because you got to move quickly.
Okay.
Yeah.
There was a play in London with Ray Fiennes as Robert Moses.
Oh, yeah, yeah, I know
Just
that,
sort of a
yeah.
whole-
Yeah. I got a degree in urban planning from Chicago. We're not a Robert Moses fan.
Well, neither is this play.
No one is. Particularly New York. I mean,
And it's
I left my phone in the car.
he, and not a defense, but from an urban planning aspect, he wanted to move people out of the tenements of the Lower East Side and give them new skyscrapers.
That's what he said.
That's what he said.
That
But
was not what he was doing.
no, I know that. Oh, I know that.
And
But
the other thing he did was he made it all car central. And every time the governor tried to get him to do public transportation,
Okay.
Michelle, we're coming back. Come on back.
William is more connected.
If you hear my voice, clap once.
Come on back.
If you hear
Thank you.
my voice, clap twice. Okay. That is what we call a pause. A pause. Because we know that these conversations, and that was what we wanted you to lean in and have these, share these experiences, these lived experiences, the questions you may have. But it's just a pause, because really the goal is that whatever we're starting here, we really are looking for you to go and continue this in other places. We're looking for you to tell those stories of your legacy and find more of your legacy and really understand, again, we're bringing back so we can move forward. Okay. So, questions?
Yeah, we're going to start with a question from online.
So this question from online is actually directed to Keith Stokes. Patricia Bash would like you to please talk more about how you think reparations could best work for Indigenous and Black people.
In the case of Providence, the Providence Municipal Reparations Plan, we're looking at Providence history, Rhode Island history, not California or Mississippi or elsewhere. And in our history, the shared experiences, the shared places of Indigenous and African heritage starts at the very beginning. In fact, any one of us that have African heritage in New England have Indigenous heritage and vice versa. So from our perspective, as we began to unfold the history and document the history, from enslavement, which initially was Indigenous enslavement, and later indentured servitude, to later in the 19th and 20th century as tribal lands were being gobbled up. In fact, in the case of Rhode Island, by 1880, the Rhode Island General Assembly completely abolished the Narragansett tribe as a sovereign entity. And that allowed them to fast-track taking all of their land, which is less than 50, 60 acres today. It wouldn't be until 1983 that the Narragansetts, would reclaim what they always owned, their sovereignty. So from our perspective in our research and the history, we saw reparations as first defining it as closing the racial wealth and equity gap. And then the eligibility definitions that we created, again, which are Providence and Rhode Island based, is one, Indigenous people, anyone that ties themselves to an Indigenous tribe who is specifically not tied to a Bureau of Indian Affairs tribe because they don't have benefits. They might be living in Providence or Bristol or Newport or Warwick, Rhode Island. Their grandparents probably moved there in the 1940s and married a Cape Verdean, but they still have that ancestry but don't have the benefits. We also use the term African heritage. African heritage recognizing the diaspora, meaning that anyone that has ties to sub-Saharan Africa from a perspective of being African American, Afro-Latino, Afro-Caribbean, Cape Verdean, biracial like myself and others. Black folks were very upset with me about that. I mean, they said, Keith, it should be just African Americans. And my response was that if you look at the demographics today in Providence, we are mixed, but we are mixed largely and centered around our African diaspora history. And in fact, the joke that I used to say is the only thing different from my ancestors in Newport and the Dominican is an extra boat trip from Africa. I mean, one was colonized by the Spanish, or the other side by the French, the other by the English. We've been colonized, we've been oppressed, we've been discriminated against. And unfortunately today, people of Afro-Caribbean, people of Indigenous that have African descent are still being discriminated against, largely because of their African features and their African heritage. So that's what we did, which again may not fit other cities and states or countries, but it fits and justifies the experiences and the history of Providence and Rhode Island.
Okay. Thank you, Keith. Any other questions? Yes.
I spent some time in southern Sudan right after the peace accord between North and Southern Sudan, and I am wondering, is that area of Africa part of the diaspora during the time period?
I mean, from a perspective of a British North American, most of the British North American activity was along the Gold, the Guinea, the Windward Coast, but particularly along the Gold Coast, which is today Ghana, and certainly northern Nigeria. And we know that by ship logs and primary documentations, but more importantly, we know that by now with DNA and by the primary records of the Africans themselves. They're saying, you know, we are Fonte, we are Akan people. We have day name customs that still exist today. And in Newport, if we brought you to our burying ground, there are hundreds of markers where Africans either maintain or reclaim their Akan day name customs, such as Kofi, which is actually Kofi, K-O-F-I, boys born on Friday, or Kujo or Kwako, which is, so for most part, being British North America, most of the Africans would arrive from what is today Ghana, Sierra Leone, Guinea, parts of Nigeria. Now, obviously, depending if they were coming from other locations through the West Indies, but that really represents the largest share, and that really is supported by the primary evidence and the secondary evidence that we've been able to uncover.
Thank you. There's another question from online.
So this question is directed to anyone on the panel, but are there any thoughts to innovative ways that Blacks, Indigenous, and Black Indigenous people can build equity other than through land ownership?
I mean, it's equity. Equity could be owning a home, owning a business. In fact, in our reparations case in Rhode Island, we're putting significant money into not only African and Latino home ownership. We looked very carefully at the data, and Providence, Rhode Island has one of the lowest Black home ownership rates in the country. It's not surprising with the cost, the history, and such. But we're also investing in business. And we're collaborating and investing in the Rhode Island Black Business Association, Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. We're also investing in urban land banks and being able to stem gentrification and be able to invest in what we call social and environmental justice. These urban areas need to be reclaimed for green space and play space and open space. But again, investing in African heritage, Latino, and Indigenous organizations. The money goes to those institutions. And if they don't have the capacity, we would provide money to help build their capacity as an institution. And again, the long run is to have ownership of land, your business, your home, your very neighborhood, and then hopefully building equity that you can pass on to the next generation. And finally, having intergenerational, multi-generational wealth.
I just want to say that I think that's a basic right to own your own home, to feel safe that you have some place to call your own. Isn't that the American dream? So I think we need to start there.
Yeah, that's right.
So my question circles back to this question of reparations and who qualifies, and it relates a little bit to what you said, Keith, 2 answers ago, I think, about not distinguishing between someone who immigrated from another part of the world but is part of that African diaspora. Because a lot of times people want clarification, well, like, who is going to qualify for this? So in Rhode Island, how did you deal with that question of qualification or, access to that resource throughout the community?
Again, it's a Rhode Island case, and we've had some criticism, and which is fine, that people have that right. But in our case, it was the historical primary data and evidence that drew us to the conclusion that reparations is about closing that racial wealth gap. We also brought in an economist and looked at present day racial base inequity in the city of Providence. So as an example, it was I think we used 5 categories: incarceration rates, home ownership rates, business rates, health equity, income. And just to give an example, quick example of that, in 2019, if you happen to live in the College Hill census tract where Brown University and RISD is, the median household income was $179,000. And it makes sense. A lot of, professors, doctors there, 98% white. In 1997, if you happen to live in the Onlyville neighborhood, the median household income was $18,700. 98% Black and brown. It also had the highest poverty rate, highest COVID rates, on and on and on. So from my perspective, if I was looking to make an investment strategy, I think Onlyville is clearly a priority over College Hill in Providence. So we really, and unfortunately, fortunately, that same data plays out. People of color, are struggling with their health and health insurance. They're struggling with employment and job training. You know this. So the data helped us to be able to put together a clear path of investment. I will also point out, we have an income requirement. Our focus was people and families making either 50% or 30% below the AMI. And that could include a white family. And CNN blew up. They were just saying, oh my goodness, whites can qualify. Well, that's not accurate, really. But if you happen to have a case where we're making a home ownership investment plan in the south side of Providence, and you have a poor white family that's living there over generations, and they happen to qualify, and out of the 99 homes we build, one goes to a white family, so what? Who cares? Help them. And more importantly, I don't want Oprah Winfrey coming to Providence and qualifying. I shouldn't qualify. It should be based upon the people that have desperate needs today and tomorrow.
We were just in our little group here talking about reparations and what might be the best. I mean, it's going to be for a committee to decide or whoever, but I see education as the way to open doors for these people, whether it's through job training, community college, regular college. We have the need for the workers. We have the need for the tradespeople. And that would help to increase their income and maybe lower interest loans on buying them. I would hate to see money handed out as reparation, because I don't know that everybody, I don't know that everybody could handle that.
I'd like to offer another way of thinking about this, just for a moment. And reparations, we deserve reparations. That's taking and addressing the past inequities, harm, lost lives, lost land, all of that. But we're in the here and now. So what are we going to do about now in terms of the practices that make it impossible for me to own a home? That means changing lending practices. That means changing health care expense, changing the cost of education for my children. And that the list goes on in places that where we are right now and our future, we can both and address what happened in the past, but that's not going to, without an intentional mindset and heart set around this should not be, and we all, as you said, the right to food, the right to housing, the right to health, all those rights are what we all as human beings are to be afforded. So it's a both and I'd love for us to start thinking about how we use our power and our privilege to create those systems that will support the livelihood of our children and our elders and all, as I said earlier, feed and serve us all, not just some, but others.
But I would just like to say that we also have to look at the structure. There's a big assumption that they're going to play by the rules. And so you could have, like, we're all assuming people are poor, they have bad health, they don't have good health care, and now they can't get, you know, a mortgage so that they can have their own home. Wonder if they have all those things and they still can't get their home. So it's an infrastructure. It's not just looking at, you know, people of color and seeing where they need the help. I think that the system itself needs to be scrutinized and changed and looked at. I know that when my parents went to buy their home in 1967, there was a white lady who thought that they should have her home, but she had to send out a petition to the entire community for them to agree that it was okay for colored people, as they were called then, to move into their neighborhood. And so that's what I'm talking about. And even though it may not be said now, that still is going on today.
That's a good point. I just want to add, I mean, access to education and job training, that's all good, but you have to be able to identify and remove the socioeconomic barriers that prohibit people from gainful employment, gainful education. So as an example, one of our reparations investment strategies is to create a beta test program called Earn and Learn, where we're setting aside $1 million that will identify 100 eligible Providence residents, and they'll be placed in a training program matched up for a career pathway in either life sciences, welding, manufacturing, whatever it might be. But during that training certification period, they'll have a full gainful tuition or salary. Because what we found in assessing the market, particularly limited income market, people aren't unemployed, they're underemployed. So what you have is you have people working 3 or 4 jobs at a Dunkin' Donuts or wherever they're doing just to keep food on the table. They can't take 6 weeks or 6 months off to get involved and immersed in a full training program. And we're quite excited about this program because both the federal and the state departments of labor and training said, boy, we love this. If it works, we can make this a permanent program and bring additional dollars to it. So there are ways that we can connect education and connect to workforce training and healthcare, but we have to be able to work with the people in their homes, in their communities, and remove those immediate barriers first.
This is a question relative to the research from the from the Reconstruction period. In doing my research for my family, I discovered that the Freedmen Bureau law, as a federal government law and rule, said that currently enslaved people, when freed, had to have a contract to work, and that was men, women, and some children, immediately after being freed. So question number 1, this was in Georgia, not here. So question number 1 is, were folks who were freed after enslavement obligated in the same way here in the North to have this work contract, which generally was with their previous enslaver? And question number 2, I also found that wills were not written by African American people in Georgia so much as the deeds conveyed the actual decisions about what would happen to property at the death of a person. And was that true here? And 3, did black women here, were they allowed to own land? Because I found that they were in the South, at least in this little tiny community I researched, unlike white women who had to have an agent when their spouse died. Those are my questions.
The Reconstruction era, was a failed federal policy, and it's a very short period of time and window, and even the Freedmen's Bureau would go bankrupt within 6 years. That's why, ironically, in the brochure you have an image there of Maggie Walker, who's the first female bank president and the founder of the St. Luke's Penny and Savings. My ancestor actually founded that order in 1869 because they moved their money out of the Freedmen's Bureau and decided to establish their own insurance and banking. They didn't trust government. But what you found for the most part is that every state, as it reclaimed its identity as a southern state, began to put in oppressive laws to restrict access and utilization of rights of now newly emancipated and freed African Americans. And every state and every city had its own, Jim Crow-like policy. Here in New England, we may not have had Jim Crow laws, but we had Jim Crow traditions. So what you found in New England is that we could own properties, we could operate businesses, but we were always within the, quote, black community, the black neighborhood. I mean, even in the colonial 19th century, across New England, they had names like Little Goree or Little Liberia or Little Africa or such. So we had very defined spaces where we could own and operate and live, but very defined. God forbid we tried to walk outside or do business outside of that space. From that, there were certain industries that we dominated. In the case of men, hairdressing and barbering, we dominated. In women, it's clearly dressmaking. I mean, they start as seamstress and sail lofts, and then they become dressmakers. My wife just did a presentation on African heritage dressmakers in the 19th century. Even in the restaurant field, the oyster house field, as they were called then. You see us dominating those industries, and that's where there's crossover. You know, white women need to have their dresses mended. White men need to have their haircuts. And again, that wealth that we were able to receive, we brought back to our neighborhoods and our communities. That was the kind of creative survival. So there is a lot of data there. You just have to find the data, and then you have to match it up with the community and the time that they lived. But the data is there.
I don't know the exact dates, but women weren't allowed to own property, but Native American women were. They could inherit the land, but as you were saying, they would have an agent or a guardian, that's what they call them, a guardian, who would speak for them, and then they would have to ask permission, and then they would post a petition in the paper in order for it to be granted. And they have to give the reason why, too. There's the earliest known woman to own property, and she ended up owning the property because she became a widow, was Zipporah Potter, and they just discovered her not too long ago in Boston, almost near the North End. But that was very rare, and it was like a glitch in the system, basically, because she had ended up with it because of her husband's passing away.
And we have another question from the chat. This one says, how does more work on genealogy, like what Bill Gates is doing and lots of people like Crystal are doing, help move this justice work forward?
When I talk about Beacon Hill, most people don't know that black people lived there, don't know that they were abolitionists, and you usually hear about William Lloyd Garrison and the black people that he helped, escape slavery, when in reality, William Lloyd Garrison would not be able to do what he did without collaboration of the black people that lived there. So it's really important to know our history as it really happened, as opposed to, telling it from the white man's perspective, to put it bluntly. And so once you see that, it has empowered me when I know that I have an ancestor, George Washington, who over 30 years created and also signed so many anti-slavery petitions he would not give up until slavery ended. That empowers me, and I think that would do the same for anyone. So I think it's very important for us to know our history.
Crystal's exactly right. I mean, I would be more interested in listening to her than Skipper Gates, because, frankly, your history is real. It's real people that can identify with people, and, it's all there. I mean, I was fortunate to grow up with a family where our kids are 10th generation Newporters, but more importantly, they kept everything, and they moved, and they were part of the early African churches, African Masonic, so those records are there, and we're able to tie those records. And, I was kidding Crystal, I have lots of business cards from Beacon Hill from the early and mid-19th century. And many of those African-American businessmen and women moved to Providence and Newport and then back to Boston. And we have all their records, but as they moved, they stayed Prince Hall Masons. They stayed connected to a black church. I mean, I have ancestors that start in the African Episcopal Church in Philadelphia. When they're in Newport, they're in the AME Church in Newport. Those that are Congregationalists in Newport are Congregationalists in Bridgeport, Connecticut, in the black churches. So it's there. We just need a new generation of black scholars, young men and women, who can lead this effort, because we have a passion and interest that, I mean, you said white, I like to use the term the owner class, that I don't think have. We have it because we enjoy it, we get excited. Let me just give you one just quick example of this, which I chair the education committee at Turl Synagogue. My maternal grandmother was Jewish in Newport and was part of the founding Jewish families. And we have everything we have in Newport's old, we're like Boston. But we have the oldest Hebrew cemetery in North America. It dates back to 1677. The Sephardic Jews that arrived, like my grandmother's people, are not from Eastern Europe. They're from the Iberian Peninsula to the West Indies to the Americas. So her language was Ladino, some Hebrew and Spanish and such. And if you came to that Hebrew burying ground, the markers are in Spanish and Hebrew. We brought a group of Latino kids from Providence a few years ago to go through that burying ground. I can't tell you how excited they got. These are Dominican and Puerto Rican kids who said, that's my papi's name, Rivera, Lopez. All of a sudden they said, you're telling us Spanish-speaking people were in America in the 17th century? Now they want to know about the synagogue, the history. They don't want to know about Thomas Jefferson. They want to know about African heritage men and women that looked like them, spoke like them. That's what they identify with. And again, all that data is there, all the records are there, we just have to present it. And that's why the work that they're doing right here in New Hampshire is incredible and needs to be invested and supported.
So my question is for Mr. Stokes on reparations on your program. Is that just for Rhode Island, or are you going to take that to a federal platform?
No, I was engaged for a Providence plan. And again, I just want to be clear, this was scaled around the Providence history, the Providence program. I know I'm going to be on a forum with Evanston next month to talk about, being the first two communities. And she's wonderful, but she'll tell you this is an Evanston model. California just came out and announced their plan, which we'll see, but their eligibility definition is African American that can trace themselves to 19th century slavery in California, which is odd because it's a free state. But in any case, we believe our plan can be scalable and it's practical, but more importantly, it's constitutional. Because believe me, as we were designing and developing our plan, every right-wing group around the nation was watching us, was making inquiries, wanted to have access to our documents, our data and such. I spent most of my last few months with our solicitor staff, making sure that the language of our final report and how we approached it. Now, I will tell you, there's some criticism. The fact that we have an income eligibility, the fact that we use African heritage and broaden the scope, we've been criticized by some traditional African American organizations. But that's their right. And then the only thing I can respond to is I have to follow the data and the legacy of Providence, not Detroit, not Chicago, not Mississippi. The other thing, quite frankly, is that politically, by using African heritage, we now create a very large, unified group of advocates. There are more African-born in Rhode Island than African-American. There are more Latinos than everyone. So the bottom line is that if we create a more unified front, that's going to give us the clout to go to the State House or City Hall or our congressmen and women and tell them, here are the programs we want you to invest in for our people.
Hello, thank you. I'm going to get a little emotional about this. When I was really young, in the late 60s, I sat in the basement in a church in Georgia, and Martin Luther King was there. He had invited those of us who had been trained to be organizers during that time. Organizers meant you talked with people, you encouraged them to speak up about what they needed so that change would be brought about in terms of equality and justice and all that. Here it is, 2023, and we are still dealing with these critical issues. And I ask you folks who gave us this wonderful presentation tonight, what are the most important things that we can do today to help bring about justice and equality and equity and all of the things that need to be done? Why are we still struggling in this country? Please tell us what are at least 2 or 3 of the most important things we can do to work with you to bring about equality, justice, all the things that's needed. Thank you.
I mean, look, forget about diversity and inclusion and focus on equity. It's about equity. It's about wealth. And I would ask anyone who calls himself an ally, either as a person or an institution or a college, invest in black people, black institutions. Put your money right here in this institution right here. You have one of the, in my estimation, because I've known Val and everyone for a long time, what New Hampshire is doing here in this Black Heritage Trail is cutting edge. And if you want to make a difference, put your money and get your allies and friends to put money in this institution. And put your money in the NAACPs and put your money in black business organizations. Forget diversity and inclusion. Once we have equity, then we'll decide where we want to live or work or be diverse. Give us and give our kids equity. Give us wealth. So And I'm just saying this as an old guy, personal level. It's invest in us. Give us the cash. Give us, and we'll make the decisions for ourselves.
Thank you. I've been told that was our last question, but I do want to name, because I think what you were just saying is related to this. There was a reaction in the room when part of a question was, can people handle getting money? And so, there was comment on the chat and a reaction in here, and I think, in a way, what you've just said has spoken to that. I don't know if anyone wants to say more.
As a part of our reparations plan, we, like several other urban cities, has a cash allotment program for very low-income families, because coming out of COVID and now the recession, it has been devastating to limited income people. So we have a cash program where I think it's up to $600 a month for dedicated families, which is funded through private foundations, not public dollars. And it gives these folks an ability to remove barriers and then step up and want to have access to education or childcare or whatever they need to do to be in that pathway of economic prosperity. So I support dedicated cash allotments that are performance-based and tied to very specific need, low-income need. And we've done that in Providence, and it's measurable, and we'll share the data with everyone.
So thank you for the discussion, And this is the place where we will be transitioning a little bit. I just wanted to share a quote before we move to closing, where I'll be inviting Angela forward. And this is it's a quote from James Baldwin, and he was mentioned earlier. And this is really about, when we talk about systems, people are systems. People make systems. So there's something about our spirits, our mindsets that need to be shifting to understand the brilliance of people of color, Black people and their contributions, who they are, that what we're building on is because of, and honoring that, celebrating it, and finding ways to be in community. So it's not just money, and it's not just, but it's who we are. So Angela is, you're going to speak now, and you are Angela Matthews, longtime Black Heritage Trail volunteer. So please close us out.
Thank you so much. I have to begin by, we had last week, we were looking at education in our state and in our country, and the week before we were looking at, wait, it was there a minute ago. What were we looking at the week before? Quick, somebody. History. And today, this focus on economics. Thank you so much. This was just an amazing presentation. And I've been taking copious notes so I could make a little bit of sense here of some of the wonderful things that we're learning today to take home with us. But I did want to thank Keith and Karen and Crystal for their fine presentations today. It was just extraordinary. Thank you. I also want to thank everyone who asked a question, including the questions that were perhaps, not necessarily something you might have agreed with, but something you listened to. This is the forum. This is the place where we ask those questions, because here is where we learn. Today continues a conversation that started with the Fall Black New England Conference this past year. Terms like redlining, high risk, high interest rate loan pools, let's see, and all kinds of other artificial barriers to access to capital are becoming more familiar to us as terms, and understanding and growing our awareness of the offensiveness of all of that and how it has to change. We're reminded of things like in 1921, Tulsa, in 1873, Colfax, Louisiana, in 1921 Tulsa, 1873 Colfax, 1923, Rosewood, Florida, and then the Red Summer of 1919, where this was spread just all across the country. Harassment, burning down whole communities. It was inspired. One thing, in the conversation that I was in, we talked about, we're primarily immigrants, first generation, second generation of immigrant families. One of the things that was successfully done by the white power structure and continues to happen, think about 45, is that they are pitting people without resources against people without resources. And so the immigrant groups were pitted against the African Americans when they arrived here. And so they are the people who participated in these riots and burning down these cities and taking away people's livelihoods. That oppression has taken so many forms, but the result of all the forms is the denial of the abundance of personal initiative. People just want to work really hard and earn a good living for their families and have legacy to pass on. All of us want that. We want to be able to leave our children with something. That has been denied historically over and over again in the examples we heard today. Let me see, where am I going from here? Oh, I wanted to reinforce that notion of the disparity in black-white wealth. So a similar study was done in the greater Boston area in 2008 that became a highlight of an application that I made to the CDFA to get funding to buy 222 Court Street. They documented the assets of comparable black families and white families in the greater Boston area. The asset base for the white families was $250,000. The asset base for the black families was $8. Okay, $8. That's all. It has entirely to do with home ownership, entirely. That's not salaries, it is assets. It's been denied for 400 years, been denied. And when the black community has been successful, Africans have been successful, African Americans taken away. It's just awful. So, to focus back on what we heard today so that we remember some of this when we leave here, I asked each of the presenters before the program what they wanted you to remember when you left. And in Crystal's case, you wanted us to remember that there was an African community that lived on Beacon Hill in the 1700s and 1800s. So I also want to mention from Crystal's remarks that I heard, her family members, her ancestors had property in Plymouth, Massachusetts, Barnstead, New Hampshire, and another town in Massachusetts that I don't remember the name of. And are any of us aware of the instance of that among our African American friends, that historically their families have owned that property and in one way or another lost it? Let me see. Karen, I really appreciated your comments about the exclusion in terms of the GI Bill and how African Americans were denied access to those privileges that the white soldiers, the white veterans after World War II had, and the marginalization in every way, including physical geography. Thank you for reminding us of that. And the way in which sharecropping was intentionally financed oppression. And Keith, I was so impressed by the way in which Rhode Island is handling reparations and what you're doing there for creating some equity for the people who have been denied it for so long. And I appreciated that what you're looking at is to maintain practical, scalable, constitutional solutions. Thank you for that. This caught my attention. There were no Jim Crow laws in the North, but there were Jim Crow traditions. So let's remember that. We might not have had specific laws on the books, although they seem to be creeping back into law. We did have Jim Crow tradition. When I thought about what we should do when we leave here, and that was a question toward the end. I think it was the last question we had. I listened to an African-American woman who is a Buddhist. I listened to a program she did a couple of weeks ago online. And I appreciated what she said because it's stuff that we can all do. So let me share with you what she said. Jerry-Ann and I had a conversation about passing out a pocket card of things I can do when I'm out there in the world. And she said, well, why don't we frame them in questions and not suggestions? And nah, I'm too old for that. I'm getting impatient. Keep a dedicated practice of ahimsa. That's nonviolence. Now, when you think about nonviolence, it's easy to think in terms of physical violence. Think about verbal and mental violence. Microaggression is a form of violence. If you don't understand that term, read Claudia Rankine's book, Citizen. That's something you can do and learn a lot about who you are, who we all are. Practice saying their names to remain mindful of what has been lost. You know who I mean. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, the list is endless. Third, always seek and speak the truth. Our history matters more for the future than for the past, and I think we heard that theme today too. Trust the ripple effect of your aunt's actions and your words in influencing others. 2 more to go. This is important. I think you can spend a little time hearing these recommendations. Try to proceed without being pleasing. Worry less about being liked. And learn to see each other as kin. And the last thing I would say is to close with the Du Bois quote that Karen, that you stated. Now, it's paraphrasing the best I can because I was taking notes. Now is the accepted time, not future day or year, but today, that we set ourselves for usefulness for tomorrow. So thank you all for coming today.